There's a lot to cover today. I'm going to do my very best to get through it all. I'm going to talk relatively quickly so we can get you guys out of here and back on the road. But we're today, for those of you who are here, I think you know that we're going to do the inspection provisions of the FRBAR contract and the NABOR contract and show you the differences between them and the similarities. We're going to start with FRBAR, primarily because it is really cumbersome to me to use the FRBAR inspection provisions. It's much more difficult. Which is why we didn't put something similar in the NABOR contract. But we're going to go through that. We're going to start with Section 9, which is the part of the FRBAR contract that addresses inspections, and that requires the seller, at the very beginning, requires the seller to pay for certain related repair costs by filling in the blanks in 3 different categories: general repair limit, wood-destroying organisms, WDO, and permit limit. And in all 3 of those categories, it is 1.5% unless you put a different percentage fee or dollar value in the blank next to the percentage. So under the FRBAR contract, right off the bat, unless there's a change made, the seller is obligated to pay up to 4.5% for any repairs, remediation, or give the buyer for credit if they can't get everything done. If everything isn't finished at closing under the repairs, under the FRBAR contract, we are required to escrow 125% of the estimated cost to complete. Now, under the NABOR contract, we escrow 200%, so we'll get to that in a minute, but there is a difference there, so keep that in mind. Each repair category is, under the FRBAR contract, is treated differently, so if you've completed all of the permit issues or the WDO issues and all you've got left is general repair, it's going to be 125% of whatever the general repair estimate was, not all 3 of them together. And even if we escrow money at closing because things haven't been done, under the FRBAR contract, the cap on the seller's obligation is the percentage or the dollar value that you placed in Section 9, which says this is what the seller is going to agree to repair or remediate. That's the cap. So even if we escrowed 125%, it's not the limit of the seller's obligation. The number that you put on Section 9 is the limit. So if 125% is less than the cap and we get to above 125%, the seller is still obligated to pay up to the cap. If 125% is more than the cap, we're not going to escrow 125%. We're going to escrow the cap, okay, because that's the obligation of the seller, okay? As in the NABOR contract of Section 11 of FRBAR, the seller is to maintain the property in the same condition it was on the effective date, and then it adds less reasonable wear and tear. I've had a few transactions where people want to argue about reasonable wear and tear. I've even had one where someone said they didn't know what broom clean meant. Thought that was interesting. Those things are all there, so there are always opportunities for fighting. Section 12 under the FRBAR contract addresses inspections. As in NABOR, the inspection period is 15 days. By default, you can put another time limit in the blank if you want to make it longer or shorter. Unlike NABOR, the inspections under the FRBAR contract are not limited to non-invasive inspections. Okay, make that clear. Anybody here ever had a mold issue or termites? They want to go behind the drywall and look? You can do that under FRBAR. Okay. The buyer has to restore the property and provide paid receipts for any damage that the buyer under FRBAR does to the property when the buyer does the inspection. So the buyer not only has to fix whatever they've drilled into to look at, but has to provide receipts for fixing it and that they're paid. Why do we want to have paid receipts? So there's no lien against the property. Okay. Under the FRBAR contract, the deadline to notify the seller of any defective condition under the inspection reports is the same as the time for the inspections. So in that extent, it is similar to the NABOR as is with the right to inspect. You've got the number of days that you put in FRBAR for your inspections, and whatever the number of days are to complete the inspection, that is also your deadline to notify the buyer. As you'll see, under the 3 different categories, different notices are required. One thing to keep in mind under FRBAR is under FRBAR, every date is time of the essence. The contract itself says that every deadline in there is time of the essence. NABOR does not do that. And although under the NABOR contract, the inspection deadlines may be turned into time of the essence because of the wording and or because of the circumstances, FRBAR, there's absolutely no question about it. So you miss it by a day, you're too late. Okay. And be careful with that. Under either contract, the biggest trap for well-meaning realtors is that they're in the midst of negotiating some type of a resolution, and as everything appears to be ready to go and everybody's agreed to everything verbally, the deadline comes and goes, and now the seller's not going to do anything, okay, and the deal falls apart. So I've seen that happen more than once. Happens since we use the NABOR contract here more frequently than the FRBAR. It happens a lot under the NABOR as is when you've got that same 15-day drop-dead deadline. So be careful with that. Okay?
So if you do it on email, is that okay if you're negotiating an email?
As long as the parties both agree, you can use an email signature under Florida's Electronic Signature Act. Okay? But texts do not work. So do not use a text specifically. Is excluded from the Electronic Signature Act. So DocuSign is okay, emails is okay. Virtually everything is okay except for texts, which means you have a problem with Generation Z because they love texts. So you have to wean them over to an email or DocuSign or something else that'll work for them. And I think that's pretty good to do to explain to them a text is not a legally binding document. And if they're sending something that they think is going to be binding, they're going to want it to be binding. Okay, so let's talk about the first category of inspections under FRBAR, and that's the general property inspection and repairs. Qualifications for inspector must be someone who specializes in and holds an occupational license, if required, to conduct home inspections. That's very similar to NABOR. Or holds a Florida license to repair and maintain the item that's being inspected. That's very similar to NABOR. Structural must be free of leaks, water damage, and structural damage. So water damage would include water stains. So that's different than NABOR. And working condition and operating in the manner designed to operate for systems and equipment. So we've got, in our next screen, we've got the section out of the contract that talks about all the things that are included. So if you read through that, both these two contracts make an effort to include a list of items which are going to be inspected, and they're included because at one point or another, a lot of these things there was argument about, are they really subject to being inspected as part of an inspection by a buyer, and that thereby making the seller have some obligation. So you can see a slight difference between these. I don't want to read through everything here. However, I do want to get down to where it says torn screens, and it's about line 297, 298, torn screens including pool and patio screens, fogged windows, and missing roof tiles or shingles shall be repaired or replaced by the seller prior to closing. So that's a mandate. That's a mandate. Okay. That also, keep that in mind, that also falls within, if you've got a number on section 9 about the seller's cap on repairs, that would fall within that. So even if there's no cap there, this contract says the seller has to fix those things. Okay, so be careful with that. Then it talks about cosmetic conditions on line 300, which are things the seller does not have to correct. And that goes through and says defined as a defect in an item, the seller is not obligated. So you go down then to 302, 303, and we have aesthetic imperfections, which are cosmetic conditions, which do not affect working condition, including but not limited to pitted marcite, tears, worn spots, and discoloration of floor coverings, wallpapers, or window treatments, nail holes, scrapes, scratches, dents, chips, or caulking in ceiling, walls, flooring, tile fixtures, or mirrors, minor cracks in walls, floor tiles, windows, driveways, sidewalks, pool decks, and garage and patio floors. Cracked roof tiles, curling or worn shingles, or limited roof tile not considered defects. So that's similar to NABOR, but that's a slightly different paragraph than NABOR. And all the items that are listed are all items which are to be inspected and for which the seller may have some liability if you put a number in the cap. Now, what's the procedure? Within the inspection period, the buyer delivers written notice to the seller of anything that the buyer has turned up that's defective. If the seller requests, then the buyer is also to send over a copy of the pertinent portion of the inspection report. It's different than NABOR. NABOR, we thought, why are we fooling around with the inspection report? We're going to mandate the inspection report go with any request to send the whole thing over. We're not going to worry about, is that page really the page? FRBAR keeps this, so keep that in mind. You don't have to send anything of the inspection report unless the seller asks for it. Okay. Seller has 10 days after receiving the buyer's notice, okay, or the general inspection report to complete the repairs at the seller's expense. How does that sound? Complete all the repairs within 10 days. Think we can get that done? Probably not. Okay, but the contract does say that if we're not done by closing, we get to have a escrow. Yes, yes.
Where it says, and I think this is the same on NABOR, within 10 days after receiving notice, there's been some question before whether the 10 days specifically starts at the 15-day finish, or if you've received your notice 5 days after the inspection, if the 10 days starts then.
Well, you couldn't receive a notice 5 days after the inspections if they're at the 15 days, because under the FRBAR contract, you only have 15 days, or what other deadline you've put in to complete the inspections and give notice to the seller.
I meant 5 days after the inspection itself. Someone did not wait for the 15-day inspection time period. They delivered their buyer request after only 5 days instead of waiting on the 15.
The seller's deadline to do what the seller is going to do starts from the date that the seller receives the notice from the buyer.
Is it the
Correct.
same on NABOR?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So we've got that going. So that's why underneath both contracts we can't put a firm date on what the deadlines are, except for the first one. We know that one. Okay. So the seller then has either the 10 days to complete the repairs, or this is FRBAR contract, have a second inspection by a professional inspector. And the professional inspector is defined as someone who's properly licensed, et cetera, the same as the requirements for the buyer earlier in the contract. Okay. Or have the repairs estimated by an appropriately licensed person and deliver a copy of either the second inspection or the repair estimate to the buyer. Okay. Now, you now have out there the repairs. You see the seller can do one of two things, either have it or both, can have it inspected by another licensed inspector and or send over a estimate for what the repairs are going to cost. Okay. So we've got now an estimate, so we know that we're arguing about the cap or not. We don't know. Okay. The parties can't agree on what items are defective and or whatever falls within the cap, then under FRBAR, they get to pay a third person to go out, and they split the cost of the third inspection, and the third inspection report is binding on the parties. Okay. Now, if the cost to repair exceeds the limit, again, the limit for the general repair limit, that's either 1.5% or some other number that you put in the blank on that section, then within 5 days after a party's receipt of the last estimate, and keep in mind, that's going to be a different 5 days for the seller and for the buyer. If the seller has to go out and get it estimated, and the seller gets it and then gives it to the buyer 2 days later, the buyer's got it 2 days later, so the buyer's 5 days doesn't expire at the same time, and that's important. But within 5 days of a party's receipt, the seller's option is the seller can elect to pay anything over the limit in the contract by written notice to the buyer. So 5 days after the seller gets that. The buyer has 5 days from the day the buyer gets the notice from the seller to deliver a written notice to the seller designating which items are to be repaired within the general repair items and to accept a credit for the balance of whatever that cap is and accept everything else as is. Okay? If neither does that, then either party can terminate the contract by written notice to the other, and there's no deadline for that. Written notice to the other, and the buyer gets back the deposits. Everybody understands how the general repair items works. Okay, that's a lot different than NABOR. So I said it's complicated because everybody is doing things, moving parts, reports going back and forth, way to settle it, get a third inspection. I think that's complicated. Okay, let's move on to termites. WDO inspections and repairs. Again, the inspector has to be a Florida licensed pest control business to determine the existence of past or present WDO infestation and damage. And WDO in this contract is defined differently than in NABOR, although I think we all agree with termites, but they specifically reference arthropod or plant life. Now that's obviously some people that know what they're talking about, right? Arthropod or plant life, including termites, powder post beetles. Has anybody ever seen a powder post beetle? Okay. Old house borers, and wood-destroying fungi that damages or infests seasoned wood in a structure, excluding fences. Oh, including fences, I'm sorry. So what's the procedure with WDO? Okay, within the inspection period, again, it's the same period because you only get one period for that, right? The buyer delivers a wood WDO report to the seller. Now, what's in that report? This is a lot different than NABOR. If the seller previously treated the improvements for the WDO type found, and there is no active infestation, okay, now understand that. We see that we've got evidence that there were termites there, but there's no evidence of live termites. The seller has to treat the building for termites unless the seller has proof that the seller already treated the building and has a full treatment warranty assignable to the buyer that the seller assigns to the buyer. Okay, now under NABOR, if we see that there were termites but there's no active termites, then the seller's kind of off the hook, right? But not under the FRBAR, okay? Now, within 10 days after the seller receives the WDO report from the buyer, so at least we're consistent in the time frame, the seller can have the damage repair estimated by appropriate licensed person and any necessary treatment estimated by a WDO inspection and copy delivered to the buyer. So now we've got a number to see exactly what it's going to cost the seller to fix whatever it is that the buyer has noted as being defective. Is that Santa Claus? The seller has to have the treatment and repairs made, but there's no deadline. I think that makes sense. It's going to take some time if we're going to bring the big yellow tent out, whatever we're going to do. It's going to take a little bit of time to get that done. Okay, we've got a closing date though, so we've got to get that done by closing. If we don't, how much are we going to escrow? 125%. Very good. Okay. If the cost exceeds the WDO repair limit, we kind of go back in a similar thing as we had in general repairs. The buyer can deliver written notice to the seller within 5 days of receipt of the seller's written repair estimate that the buyer will pay the excess. Okay, so I want to tent the whole building. It's going to cost more money. I'll pay the extra on the buyer. Okay, or the buyer can designate which WDO repairs the seller is going to make within the limit and accept the balance up to the limit and the rest of the property as is. So it's similar to the general repair items there. The buyer has some options. Okay, if neither party does that, the buyer doesn't do that, doesn't deliver the notice to the seller of either designating part of the place or agreeing to pay the excess, then either party can terminate. Okay, because remember, the seller's not obligated to pay more than whatever the WDO limit is, and if it's going to cost more than that, the seller's not required to do anything. So either party can terminate. There's no deadline for that termination. Okay. Building permits, inspection and closeout. So this is again different than NABOR. So the procedure, the buyer delivers to the seller within the inspection period, which again is going to be 15 days, notice of open or expired permits or unpermitted improvements. So whatever the buyer has determined is out there, delivers a notice, okay? If the buyer identifies permits not properly closed or unpermitted improvements, the seller must promptly deliver to the buyer all plans and documents and information in the seller's possession, knowledge or control related to whatever it is that the buyer has pointed out or unpermitted or improper improvements, okay? The seller has 10 days from receipt of the buyer's notice under the permit section to get an estimate of the cost to remedy from an appropriately licensed person and send that to the buyer. So once again, we've got a number in the contract that's going to be a cap on the seller's obligation, and that's why the seller is required to go out and get an estimate of what it's going to cost to fix whatever it is. Okay? The seller has until 5 days prior to the closing date, up to the permit limit, to have open or expired permits identified by the buyer, or, and this is interesting, or known to the seller. Okay? So the seller is not only on the hook for fixing everything that the buyer finds out about from the buyer's investigation, but the seller in the FRBAR contract has to fix those things and any other permit-related issue known to the seller. Okay? And boy, that opens the door. When I was first down here, we had lots of Florida rooms, none of which were permitted. Okay? It was the lanai in the back of the house that the property owner had closed in and used the air conditioner from the house, sometimes with a window air conditioner. And there were lots of Florida rooms. I know you remember those, Linda and Alan. That was the big unpermitted improvement for years down here. Golden Gate then had a bunch of them as well. So there's an issue there with respect to permits, okay? So known to the seller. And if the final permit inspections cannot be performed, so if we haven't finished it by the closing date, we have finished, but we can't finish the final permit inspections, getting the government to go out and sign off on and issue a certificate of occupancy or a certificate of completion, then the closing is extended up to 10 days. And if it's still not done, unlike the escrow under the other two sections, if it's still not done after 10 days from the closing date, either party can terminate the transaction and the deposit goes back to the buyer. Okay? Now, if the cost to remedy all of the defects that the buyer turns up exceeds the permit limit, within 5 days of receipt of a cost estimate, the seller can deliver to the buyer written notice that the seller will pay the excess and take care of it. And the buyer may deliver it to the seller written notice, accepting as is with a credit. Okay, so the seller doesn't have to do anything under this section if the buyer says, I'll take it the way it is, just give me a credit for the permit limit. Okay, everybody understands that? Now, under the statutory amendment of a few years ago, it's a lot easier to close these things out than it used to be for somebody who wasn't in privity with the construction or whatever it was that wasn't permitted properly. Okay, so that's not necessarily a bad gamble for a buyer to take care of. Okay, what are the repair standards under the FRBAR contract? Okay, it has to be good and workmanlike. The person doing the work has to be appropriately licensed. The work has to meet all legal requirements, which means it has to be permitted. Okay, has to be comparable or better components than were there on the effective date. Okay, and the seller is to assign all assignable treatment and maintenance contracts and warranties, except for WDO, which is addressed in the WDO inspections. Okay, and that's to be assigned to the buyer if the buyer wants that, and if there's any cost to the assignment, the buyer pays the cost. Okay, a note, the buyer has no right under the FRBAR contract to select the company to do the repair work. Parenthetically, the buyer has no right under the NABOR contract to select the company to do the repair work. Where do we see that, where the buyer is really wedded to somebody to do the repair work? Most often, in my practice, it's radon mitigation and mold. Okay. Okay, how do we determine that all these things have been done, in addition to whatever the seller provides to prove that the seller did what the seller claimed to do? Under the FRBAR contract, the buyer has a walkthrough right. Everybody knows what that is, yes? I tell the story a few years ago. I had a closing one time where I did the closing, sat down with my client, and the client said everything was great, walkthrough was wonderful. And a few days later, he called me and said there was no carpeting, appliances, or window treatments in his condominium unit. And I asked him if it was there on the walkthrough, and he said he didn't know because he just drove by and looked really good on the outside. But anyway, the walkthrough is the opportunity for the buyer to go through, and FRBAR says it has to be on the day prior to or the day of closing at a time specified by the buyer. And that's when the buyer can verify that the repairs have been properly made, that the property has been maintained, and that all the personal property that's supposed to be there is still there. And parenthetically, all the personal property that's supposed to be gone is gone. Okay? Okay, any questions about FRBAR? Good. We're going to get this done. All right. Who here uses the FRBAR contract all the time? Okay. Well, I just want to warn you, there are a lot of traps for the unwary in the FRBAR contract. I don't think it's as user-friendly as NABOR, but I'm also not on the committee that drafts it, and I've turned down the opportunity to be on the committee that drafts it, so I'm on the committee that drafts the NABOR contracts. But be careful, if you're using a FRBAR contract, people from Miami love it, people from other areas of the state use it. So if it comes in here and you're using it, be sure that you understand and that you're not telling your customer something about a contract that you think is correct because it's NABOR, but it's not. So let's talk about NABOR then, at least with respect to inspections. Yes, ma'am.
I believe in the last one of yours that we attended, you said, we asked the question, if a contract comes in, an offer on FRBAR and you're going to counter it anyway, we have switched it over with a counter on a NABOR contract. And I believe you said that's not a good idea, and I wondered why.
Well, I only said it was not a good idea because I hate to mess up a deal in the middle of a deal. So if I'm working, and every answer that I give is subject to your broker's approval, okay, that's my disclaimer. But my thinking along those lines is, even if you're not familiar with the FRBAR contract, you're better off affiliating with an attorney or someone who is familiar with it, in my opinion, than you are to change the contract form in the middle of the transaction, because of the impact that could have on the, let's say the buyer's making the offer on a FRBAR contract. How will that impact the buyer and the comfort level of the buyer with the transaction? Are we going to be able to continue? So that's my concern with that. I don't think these contracts are so different that using one or the other is really going to damage the transaction. But I think switching contracts is like switching horses in midstream. I think that could, and you're in sales more than me, could psychologically affect the transaction, might lower the price, might make the buyer more wary. That was my concern. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I did have that happen in March, but the condo was very sought after. It was a Miami agent that was trying to send over an old contract. I think a NABOR that was like 2014, and I just told her, "Here's the latest one. Please use this."
Yeah, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just suggesting that, to me, it seems like that would be a difficult switch unless it really need to. And there are some reasons that you might want to, but you have to really delve into the contract. So one reason would be, if I'm a seller, I don't want to be on the hook for any kind of a percentage. And if the buyer thinks that I'm going to have a seller who's going to pay 1.5% of the sale price to fix things of 3 different categories, and I now say no, I've now got a very unhappy buyer, and that may affect my sale price, yada, yada, yada. So there's just a lot of reasons why you might want to use the NABOR contract, but that's up to you guys. All right, let's go to the NABOR contract and inspections. Okay, we got section 8, which is where we check the box under NABOR. We have 2 options under the NABOR contract. One is the buyer is going to conduct the inspections under standard D2. The other box is the buyer is going to waive all inspections and buy the property as is. So if you're really trying to write an as-is contract, use the residential improved form and check the waiver box. That's as is. That's it. Buying it just like it is. The as-is contract gives the buyer a certain number of days to conduct inspections and then terminate the contract if the buyer decides to terminate, which is really an option. Okay, so if you're really looking for a complete waiver and an as-is contract, and when might be used that? We get more and more tear downs these days. So if you've got somebody who's buying it for lot value, who's going to tear down the property, I mean, they probably really don't care about any inspections. That's fine. I've seen it with tenants living in a property. They're buying the property. They've been the tenant for 3 years. Now they're buying it. They've been taking care of it, repairing it, doing everything anyway. They'll waive it. That's the deal they have with the seller. But that would be a time when you might want to have a real as-is, or a buyer would be comfortable with that. So inspections under the NABOR contract, we go to standard D2. Okay, and just as in FRBAR, we've got a 15-day, unless you put a different day in the blank, 15 days to complete inspections. Okay. And the inspections are to include 6 categories. So FRBAR has 3 different categories of inspection items. NABOR has 6, but they're all under one block, and those are the property, appliances, equipment, which is the equipment's known as systems and equipment. And that's to be inspected by an appropriately licensed inspector or company or contractor with a Florida license to repair or maintain the item. So you either have to have a licensed inspector or a Florida licensed person who can repair or maintain the item. Now keep in mind, under both the FRBAR and under NABOR, it has to be a Florida license. I haven't had that argument, but I could see it coming that, Uncle Fred's the general contractor in Wisconsin, and he has a general contractor's license, and he's going to do the inspection. That's fine under the as-is contract, and not fine under either FRBAR or NABOR's residential improved. Second category is radon gas. Radon gas has to be done by a certified radon measurement technician or specialist. Don't ask me what that means, but I can tell you they have to have some type of certification to do that. 3 is lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard. That inspection has to be by an EPA certified lead exposure risk assessor. We only have to worry about that for pre-1978 homes, okay? Because there's putting paint in it, and the federal government only requires lead and paint. The federal government only requires the lead paint disclosure for pre-1978. Okay. Termites or other wood-destroying organisms, and there's not a list in this contract as there was in FRBAR to make sure that we understood what that meant. That has to be done by a certified pest control operator. We can also inspect air, surface, dust, and/or other industry-accepted sampling by a qualified indoor air quality inspector for toxic or pathogenic molds. Okay. And keep in mind on mold, it has to be toxic or pathogenic. Okay. So there's a problem here because we see, and we'll get to that in a minute, but Penicillium aspergillus is defined in the contract as not being toxic or pathogenic, nor any other allergenic mold as being toxic or pathogenic. So if you have a customer who's got a breathing issue or child with asthma or something like that, you need to know your customer, and the standard inspection, you'll come back and you'll get that inspection report and it'll say there's some mold in the place. You see Penicillium aspergillus all the time. And then the buyer wants to have that remediated, and we have to tell them, no, it doesn't work that way. The contract specifically says it's not. What does that do for your relationship with the buyer? They're not happy at that point, okay? Yes?
I don't know if I missed it, but did the FRBAR contract address this particular point?
No. FRBAR contract is silent on mold. Okay? All right. And then we also have the ability under this contract to search for open building permits, non-conforming structures, unpermitted improvements, and violations of local ordinance. And that can be done by anyone. Okay, there's not a particular requirement to do that because that's basically a government record search. Now, when we're on this, under both contracts, keep in mind one of the things that I warn people about is when you see in the MLS, and it's a selling tool, newly remodeled kitchen and baths, that is your warning that they needed newly pulled building permits and closings, okay? And it's important that you tell that to the attorney that's doing the closing so they can look to see if those were permitted and those improvements were permitted, because otherwise what we'll do is we'll commission a search of open permits, and if it comes back that here are all the permits and they're all closed, then that's a clean search. Unless you say, hey, in 2021, they redid the bathrooms and kitchen, make sure that was permitted. That happens in condos a lot. The handyman goes in and he starts doing work for 1 and then 5 and then 12, and sometimes then he leaves 7 of them unfinished. But they get in there and they start doing all that work, and he does what appears to be a nice job, but unfortunately, anytime you're doing that, you've got electrical and you've got plumbing, and you're going to have permits for that. And you go back in and find out that that work wasn't properly done problematically, or B, if it was properly done, at least you can get an after-the-fact permit. But those are issues. So be sure you tell that. Why? Because NAR and Florida Realtors are making you guys up to be really experts about real estate. And so if you're showing a property and the selling point is newly remodeled kitchen and or baths, you're on notice that that needed to be permitted, so you're going to probably have a liability, if nothing other than an unhappy customer who's not going to send you any more business. So that's a big deal to me. Okay. All right. Inspections under the contract for all of these things. The inspections must be non-invasive, no perforation or removal of anything structural. Okay, that's different than FRBAR. That's a big difference. So if you really want to get a big deal inspection, you use the FRBAR. Now you got to go through all that rigmarole. I've done this, the seller does that, comes back, I have this, I have that. I like this procedure. I do have a lot of times when somebody wants to go behind the drywall and see the extent of whatever mold might be there. And that's usually when that mold report comes back and it says there's mold. And they want to say, how bad is it? We can't do that without the seller's consent. Okay, if you get the seller's consent, you can do it. Okay? And as in the FRBAR contract, the buyer must repair any damage that the buyer does doing inspections. Now, D2B is the part that talks about defective inspection items. And this is important because just as in FRBAR, I'll be with you in a second, just as in FRBAR, you have to look at every contract that you're using and see what the definition is of a defective item. You know, how many times have you had to tell people, you're not buying a new house? You're buying, you got a 15-year-old refrigerator? Yeah. A 28-year-old roof? Yeah. Okay, that's the way it works. So you got to look and see, what does the contract define as defective? Al?
Go back one more slide. At the bottom of that, it says, seller must provide access upon reasonable notice.
Yes.
So if you've got an occupied condo in the middle of season, and the renters don't want to let you in, basically, you can basically impress them that this is not the way the contract's written?
You can try. The statute also says the tenant has to allow access, but how many times have we had tenants say, no, I'm down here on vacation. I've only got 1 week or 2 weeks. You're not coming in here and screwing up my vacation. I'm here. You're not coming in. It's in the story. So I get that, and we've done lots of those arguments, and sometimes we win some, and sometimes we lose. Sometimes we win those because we offer a little sugar to the tenant, maybe buy them lunch somewhere, do whatever we need to do. I don't do that. Realtors sometimes do that, and I suggest that. But it's one of the few times I think spending a couple of bucks might pay a big dividend, because that's enough to say, hey, listen, we know you're enjoying your vacation. How about we buy you lunch, go out, it costs $100, you get the inspector in, you get it all taken care of. I'm not telling you to do that, but that's just one option, okay? Otherwise, the tenant says no, we're not going to go to court and force that tenant to let us in to do an inspection, but the transaction might fall apart. Okay. All right. So what's a defective inspection item? Systems and equipment. We're going to get to a little bit later. Not in working condition, which means it's not operating as it was designed to operate. So if we've got a 13-year-old refrigerator and it's got a rusty door, is that it's still cooling the food? Is that working? How about an air conditioner? It's got a disgustingly looking air filter, but it's working and cooling the air. How many reports do we get back on those? Recommend replacing the air filter and cleaning the air conditioner. It's disgusting. Right? It's working. It's not defective. Okay, so that's something that's important. And that's one of those things, and I'm not in sales as much as you. I try to hold deals together, but it's one of those things you have to kind of, I think before the inspection even gets done, you have to lay the table for your buyer and say, this is the way this is going to happen. This is what the standards are. You need to read this. This is what it is. Just because it comes back and says that they recommend that you clean this or clean the duct work or whatever it might be, that doesn't mean it's not working. So we're getting something, and what the standard is, it has to be in working condition. This is working. And you can show them the contract. They can read it for themselves, okay? We have a standard for radon. That's the EPA standard. It's 4.0 picocuries per liter, okay? Presence of lead-based paint, well, that's self-explanatory. Active and destroying organisms, wood-destroying organisms and or visible damage. And so be a little later, we're going to see that differs significantly from FRBAR. The biggest difference is, unless we can see active wood-destroying organisms, the seller has no obligation to repair. It's not a defective item. Okay. Under NABOR, right? Okay. Okay. Mold, the toxic or pathogenic. Remember, that is important. Modification of mold, which, as we mentioned, is not in the FRBAR contract at all. Toxic or pathogenic mold has to be at a level higher than the exterior of the property, and that's what they have to measure, both inside and outside. And I always use going down someplace, we got a cabin down in the Everglades, and there's all kinds of mold outside, and there's all kinds of mold inside, but it's the same mold, and it's about the same level. Okay, that's not elevated mold inside, that's the same, okay? So that's how that test is done. And then we can search for void, expired, issued, open. There's a whole list of permit issues that we can do. Yes, ma'am?
If there have been mold, mold in a place and it's been cleaned up by a licensed person, does the seller have to disclose that?
In my opinion, no, because it's no longer a defect, no longer something the seller knows about. However, I did have a transaction years ago where the buyer bought a home, and after she closed, she found out it had been in a fire. And she found out it had been in a fire because in the garage where they repainted, they didn't paint behind the hot water heater because they couldn't get there, but there was soot from the fire. And she really was upset because she had been in a fire, and to think that she was now in a home that had been in a fire was incredibly unnerving to her. And I had to explain to her that I didn't think that was a defect or something the seller would have to tell because it had been fixed. In fact, the house was probably in better shape after the fire than it was before because, it was all new, all painted, everything was brand new. But she was so upset by that I believe she sold the house and moved someplace else. So there's a good example. So to her, that was a defect the seller had to disclose. To me, to most buyers, that wouldn't have been a huge thing. Okay. Same thing with termites, same thing with mold, same thing with radon. If you've got all this done, it's not a defect at the time of the effective date of the contract. Okay. Okay. So what's the procedure under NABOR? Okay. Unlike FRBAR, the buyer gets a little more time after the inspection period is over. The buyer has 5 days. Remember, they have 15 days unless you put another date in the blank to do the inspections. The buyer has 5 days after whatever deadline you've put in there to notify the seller of any defective inspection items, and at the same time to give the seller a copy of the inspection report. Now remember, the 6 categories included permits, and the last time I checked, y'all are not doing open permit searches and other related to that, but the attorneys that close the deals are. Under the NABOR contract, you get 1 notice to the seller, as long as that report has been done in time, of what the buyer wants the seller to fix as a defective item. Okay? If you make the request for everything and leave permits off, we can't make another request for permits unless the permit search was commissioned within 5 days of the effective date, which means you have to get the contract to the buyer's attorney right away, and the results of the permit search weren't back in time. So if they weren't back in time, then we get to extend the deadline, and we pick back up with 5 days after we get it. We have to tell the seller what we want fixed. Seller has 10 days to respond, etc. Okay, everybody understands that? So it's really important that you coordinate with the closing attorney to make sure that the permits and all the other items that the buyer might want to have fixed are all in the same request, because you only get 1. Okay? Okay, so now if the buyer wants a credit, the buyer can either ask for the repairs or a credit equal to the cost of the repair, and you can mix and match. So the buyer could say, I want a credit for the cost of a new air conditioner to replace the old one, and I want you to repair all the other stuff. Okay. If you're going to ask for a credit, you have to include a copy of a proposal or an estimate for what it's going to cost to fix whatever it is you want a credit for, and the credit has to equal that cost. And that goes to the seller with the request. Okay? Now, if you don't...
Does the NABOR specify a licensed contractor for those repairs?
NABOR contract does not specify that. Okay? Now, if the buyer doesn't send a notice, then the buyer accepts the condition of the property as is. Okay? And the buyer's notice and the seller doesn't apply to anything that the seller is not obligated to repair or take care of under any obligation of a condo or HOA.
If the buyer is looking for a credit and they choose a contractor to do the work that certainly good, but is a high-priced contractor, does the seller have, and the seller say, no, we're just going to repair it, or we'd like to get another bid? Is there any?
No, the buyer has no right to select any contractor to do the repair work. The buyer has the right to select the inspector. The seller is completely in control of the repair.
But the estimate, if the buyer is requesting a credit instead of the repair, and the buyer provides the estimate, does the seller have the right to get another estimate?
Does not have the right. It might be prudent to do so if the seller thinks that the buyer has gotten the most expensive person in town to make the estimate. But now, if the seller does, we're getting to that in a minute, but if the seller does anything other than say, okay, and everything the buyer has requested is within the scope of what the buyer is entitled to request. So remember, cosmetic items are excluded and certain other things are excluded, which we'll get to in a minute. As long as the buyer is requesting things that the buyer is entitled to request, if the seller does anything other than say okay, then the buyer can back out of the transaction. So the seller doesn't have it's not the same competing proposals like we had under FRBAR, and then we're going to figure out what we're going to do with that, okay? Okay. So after we've done that, now remember we talked about if we're going to do the permit search takes longer than the actual inspections, and it runs past that 15 days plus 5, then we can extend the time for sending over our request on permits until we've got the inspection report in, and 5 days after we've got that on permits, and then we start the whole process on permits. But right now, at least in Southwest Florida, we're able to get permit searches back within the inspection period. It doesn't take very long, maybe a few days. It was at one point taking 3 or 4 weeks to get inspection reports back on permits, so one of the reasons the contract reads the way it reads, in case we ever fall back into that, or if it's used someplace else in the state. So what happens after the buyer sends that notice over to the seller has 10 days after receipt. Remember, that's 10 days after seller receipt. Linda, you had a question about that? It's not 10 days from the day that the buyer sends it over. It's 10 days from the seller's receipt, okay, of the buyer's election and the reports to notify the buyer if the seller accepts and will do what the buyer has requested. And if the buyer doesn't say, if the seller doesn't say anything back to the buyer, that's a rejection of the request. Okay, now, seller has 10 days to do that. So if we go through the 10 days and we get to the 10th day and the seller hasn't said a word, now the buyer has 5 days from the seller's response. Again, that's why we can't calendar these with any certainty just as they progress. The seller responds in 7 days, I'll do everything but number 1. Or if the seller doesn't say anything, whatever the date that the seller responds, or if the seller doesn't respond, whatever the deadline was, the buyer has 5 days from that date to respond to the seller. So remember, the seller has not accepted everything that the buyer has asked for. So what happens? The buyer has 5 days after that to either do nothing, which means the buyer has accepted the seller's response, or lack of response. So if the seller did not respond and the buyer doesn't say anything, the buyer is accepting the total rejection of whatever the buyer asked for. Okay? If the buyer decides that the buyer is unhappy with the seller's response, the buyer's only option under the contract is to terminate the contract and get back the buyer's deposit. Now, that all presupposes that everything on the buyer request is a defective inspection item. It's not cosmetic. It's not something else. It's not included as a defective inspection item. And that's the difference between professionals and non-professionals. Professional realtors will help make sure that that request is limited to defective inspection items as defined by the contract. Non-professionals will send over the whole laundry list of all the stuff that the home inspector said isn't quite up to speed, not the way you'd like it, squeaky, maybe this or that, and request all that stuff get fixed. And that just mucks up the transaction. So if that is the bane of the realtors on the Legal Resources Committee, is people asking for things to get fixed that they're not entitled to ask for under the NABOR contract. I can tell you, after sitting through meeting after meeting and drafting the contract, we keep changing the verbiage on the buyer's election and seller's response form on the NABOR forms to try to make it clearer and clearer that you can only ask for things that are defective inspection items under the contract, but people still do that. And that's what happens when you've got 8,000 realtors in Collier County and only, 800 of them are full-time working? So you have to watch this happen, okay? Y'all will not be in that boat, so I'm proud to tell you that, okay? Now, if any action requires an association's approval, okay, if the seller fails to deliver written documentation of association approval 5 days prior to the closing date, so we've got to do some things, but the association has to approve it, the buyer can terminate the contract. So remember, there's no deadline for the seller to complete all these repairs. The seller has a deadline to say, I'll do it or I won't do it. And the buyer has a deadline to say, okay, I accept your response or I don't. But there's no deadline for the seller to complete everything. Now, the contract does require that the parties act in good faith and do those things. So the seller would have to proceed in some method of due diligence. But if the seller doesn't do that, remember what we talked about, and coming up in a minute, 200% escrow for anything that doesn't get finished as of closing. That's 200% of the estimate of the whole job. And I can tell you, sellers are really unhappy with the roof is 3/4 finished, and they've made 2 draw payments to the roofer, 40% at time of contract, and another 20 or 30% at, whenever they dry it in. And now we're saying, okay, we're going to escrow $200,000 because that's what the bid for the roof was $100,000, right? But that's what it is. Okay.
Why do we leave it that way?
Well, we're really trying to make sure that the big issue here is if we don't have enough escrowed, how do we get it? Okay, and I can tell you that's a road we don't want to travel down. The only people that do well there would be me as a litigator, and I talk people out of lawsuits all day long. So that's why it's 200. We have that discussion, and we know what it is in FRBAR. We know what it is in ours, and we leave it at 200. It's also an incentive to get the work done. If you know you've got a 200% escrow later. Okay. Now, what else is wrong with an escrow under both contracts? What else is wrong? Lenders don't like escrows. I mean, think of that $200,000 escrow. I mean, that probably makes hairs on the back of a lender's neck go up, right? So the contracts mandate, both contracts mandate, here it is. You didn't get it finished, we're going to escrow money. Now, that's if the parties don't agree to some other number. Both contracts allow that to happen. If you could agree to less. And I've had the roof deal, and I've had people agree to less than the 2 times the actual cost of the roof. That's fine. If they agree to it, that's okay with me. But if you've got a loan, and the lender is going to say, oh, you're escrowing $150,000 for these unfinished repairs. First, of course, the lender's unhappy here about unfinished repairs. but they really focus on that escrow because many of them believe that the escrow is just a kickback to the buyer. So the buyer's not really paying what the buyer's supposedly paying by contract. The buyer's paying less whatever the escrow might be, okay? So you have to be careful with that. So if you've got a finance transaction, you're waiving the finance contingency. We're not going to go through all of those things that happen in the difference, and there's a huge difference between FRBAR and NABOR and the finance contingency. But if you do that, and we've got repair issues, we may end up not being able to get a loan because we've got an escrow mandated by contract. You see where I'm headed with that? And if you had anything to do, of course, even if you didn't, it's all your fault that the buyer waived the financing contingency and now is going to lose the deposit, right? Because realtors get blamed for everything that goes wrong. So if that's the case, that can go wrong. So there's an unexpected consequence. You've got everybody that's great. You've got somebody who's got plenty of money, maybe could almost pay cash, but doesn't want to because they're really happy with their investments. Can't liquidate them very easily. Could have maybe 2 months ago, but now not so easy to get out of whatever they're in, or they went into something like that because they were going to finance. Now they can't get the loan because we've got an escrow. Okay, it's going to fall on you. So be careful with that. Okay. All right. Let's talk about remedial action. Systems and equipment have to be in working condition. Radon gas 4.0 picocuries per liter. Less than that. Lead bait. You know, you do know how they fix the radon issue, right? They just bring in more air from outside. And since I've been here for a while, I loved it when they first started doing that. They'd bring in more air from outside, and they found out now they had a mold problem because the air down here is moist. So now they bring it in and dehumidify it as well. Okay. But that was a good try in the early days of radon mitigation. And don't tell everybody that there's no radon on Marco, because there is. All right. All right. Lead-based paint hazard has been remediated according to the HUD EPA guidelines. Active infestation of wood-destroying organisms have been exterminated or treated, and all visible damage repaired. So here's a big difference from FRBAR. FRBAR, if you got evidence that there were bugs there, you got to treat it unless you've treated it and give a warranty, right? So here, you only have to treat for bugs if you see live ones. Okay? And that's a big argument because sometimes there's lots of dead ones lying around, and the pest control person will say, well, that's evidence that there's probably live ones somewhere, but we didn't see any. Okay? Okay. Toxic or pathogenic mold is equal to or less than what's outside. And we've got the government signing off on certificate of occupancy or certificate of completion for any of the permits that didn't get obtained, and everything's been brought into line from a permitting standpoint. Okay. Now let's talk about the list of things that have to get repaired under the NABOR contract. What does it mean to be in working condition? This is probably the most important paragraph, in my opinion, for you to talk to your customer about. And I don't know how much detail you go into contracts when you have people sign them, but this, from a buyer's perspective, and from a seller's perspective too, this tells you what the buyer is entitled to have. So working condition, if it's a system or equipment, means operating in the manner designed to operate. So we talked about that. Roof, ceiling, interior and exterior doors and walls, foundation, swimming pool, spa and pool, spa decks, working condition if structurally sound and watertight and free from wood rot. Okay? Seawalls, docks, pools, and line closures, working condition if structurally sound. Seller shall not be obligated to take remedial action or grant a credit with regard to a cosmetic condition. And we talk about that, very similar to FRBAR, is an aesthetic imperfection which does not affect the working condition of the item, including corrosion, tears, worn spots, discoloration of floor covering or wallpaper, or window treatments, missing or torn screens, nailed holes, scratches, dents, chips, caulking, pitted pool surfaces, minor cracks in windows, driveways, sidewalks, pool spas, decks, garage, etc., etc., etc. Okay, curling or worn shingles and limited roof life, so long as there's no evidence of structural damage. So very similar to FRBAR, not identical. But line 315 is not in FRBAR because it's not needed, because you have other things talking about money. But this is the line that I always remember when I represent a seller, and I always forget when I represent the buyer. And that is, no cost to repair or replace any systems and equipment item shall exceed the fair market value of that item if it were in working condition. So if we go back in the contract and see what systems and equipment are, that's air conditioning, major appliances, things like that. So that's where we talk about what does it cost, what's a used value of a refrigerator. You know, I think that's a great example. I don't know how expensive your refrigerators are. I think mine's about $1,500, maybe $1,600. But I can buy a used one. They tell me, I used to think $100. Now they tell me $200 for a used one, right? So that's the limit for the seller, because what's the theory here? And we said it earlier. You're buying a used house. It's a used refrigerator. What's a used refrigerator worth? This is it. So that's the limit. Now, again, I told you, I always remember that when I represent the seller. I kind of forget it when I represent the buyer, but it's there. You guys need to be aware of it, okay? Because it might be somebody like me who happens to remember that when needed.
It's always a question, and you're right, that's a huge sentence in the contract, and it's always a question, what about an air conditioner? And we've had this happen the day before closing. For some reason, the air conditioner goes out, and in the inspection, it doesn't pass. And somebody says, I want a new air conditioner. And then you bring this up, and somebody says, who's going to tell me what a 15-year-old air conditioner sells for? No one sells a 15-year-old air conditioner. How do you deal with that?
I call Charlie, and you know, he's kind of a politician kind of guy, so he will tell us something. But no, you're absolutely right. That's a tough one, because I look at a 15-year-old air conditioner, what's it worth for scrap? If it's got some value, that's it, right? So that
it's obviously not working in the manner which we decide to function.
Right, and you can
It's-
buy a used refrigerator and say, here
Right.
you go. You can't buy it.
Well, you actually can. They're just not readily available. Okay. So that I'm right with you on that. But again, the contract tries to remedy most ills and can't address everything. I mean, it's already, what are we, 12, 13 pages now? When I started down here, it was one page on the front, then it became 2 pages, and you know, just kept morphing up. So every time we talk about something and we're talking about words going in or out, we're looking at, you know, what that does to the length of the agreement. So you're absolutely correct. An air conditioner is one that probably we might want to carve out sometime. That's something that I'll bring up at Legal Resources. We'll be working on the new contracts again. I'm not sure if it's this year. When did this one come out? What's the date on the bottom? 2022. So we'll be doing it next year. Okay, so I'll put that on my list of things to talk about in the committee. Okay. Anybody else have anything on air conditioning units? But this is one, and we've had that argument. I have had it. Yes, sir.
I got a guy, come off the truck.
That guy is from Miami.
All right, these things happen. Yes, sir.
I had a 12-year-old air conditioner up at Forest Glen that was working fine, but it was leaking. And I was on the seller side. My seller's in Britain, by the way. And so the buyer went in and got an estimation of fixing the leak, which was $1,600. So we sent a request for credit at closing to take care of the leak. Well, obviously, he was going to replace the whole thing and wanted the $1,600 to put in his pocket. It took me about 2 phone calls and 3 phone calls to convince my British seller that, no, I know you can get it repaired cheaper than that, but he wants the credit at closing so he can buy a new AC that's 12 or 14 years old. So that was just one of the obstacles to overcome long distance with the seller.
Yeah, I think getting a credit for something that's a 14 or 15-year-old air conditioner because something's defective in it. You said it was leaking, so the buyer wants to replace it, wants a credit. All that makes good sense. Most of the time on those air conditioner things, we're talking about replacing the whole air conditioner because it's shot. Other than when we had the super hot market where it went up in value 5% a week, most of the time we're able to get buyer and seller to agree on some kind of a credit between them that makes sense. With the buyer going to have an air conditioner that should last 10 to 15 years, and the seller has some kind of a repair replacement. What are they going to do on that? And we do that on roofs too. I think similar approach. A roof's going to cost $100,000, but it's going to last 20 years. How much of a credit should the buyer get? I mean, that works out. Usually the buyer gets more of a credit than the pro rata portion, and everybody's okay. But that's about the best we can do on those, I think. Okay. All right, so what happens then if the repairs are done, remediation is completed? Okay, closing, as I said, if not done by closing, we're mandated to escrow. That's a deal killer sometimes when you got a finance transaction. The buyer gets to do the walkthrough, Doesn't get to go through earlier to make sure all these things were done. The walkthrough under both contracts is when the buyer gets to go through and make sure that all that work was done, and that the property is in the condition it was in on the effective date, and that it is ready to close. So that's what the buyer gets. So the buyer doesn't get to be there when the repairs are made. The buyer doesn't get to go through earlier when the repairs are purportedly completed, and some buyers want to do that. So if you have a buyer like that, then you need to write something in the contract that provides for that right. I hesitate to tell you to do that at all, because every time we put something in there that allows the buyer to start monkeying around with what's going on, it becomes a problem for everybody. Now, I do get asked, how do we know that the electric work was properly done if we can't get behind the drywall? Well, it was permitted and it was past inspection by the county or the city, and that's about as good, and you had a licensed person doing the work, so that's about as good as it's going to get, because you can't get a permit without the proper license, okay? So that's how you have to put the buyer's mind at ease that the work was properly performed. But they do want to do that, and I've had deals over the years where they're adamant they got to tear out the drywall and make sure everything is okay. And that's a tough buyer to deal with, but that's how we deal with it. So that's what happens. The seller does have to provide access and utilities upon reasonable notice to the buyer to do the walkthrough. So under both contracts, that's an obligation on the seller, which means that we do not have the seller turn off the utilities prior to closing. Okay? I haven't had that happen in a long time. But why it does happen is because people are cheap and they don't want to pay the electric bill for an extra day, so they manage to turn it off. And what happens? Closings always happen on the day they're supposed to happen, right? Okay, maybe not. So closing goes one more day, and now we do the walkthrough and there's no power. Okay, so tell your cheapskate sellers, keep the power on. I say this all the time. I tell my folks, turn it off the day after you actually close. I have, in 40 years of practicing here in Marco, I have not ever had anybody call me and say, you told me not to turn the electric off. The buyer apparently moved in, opened all the windows and doors, and turned the air conditioner down to 60 and ran it all day long. I've never had anybody tell me that. I don't think it's happened. It might, okay, but even so, how much is that going to cost? Okay, not too much. But it'll avoid a lot of problems. Same thing with insurance. Tell them not to turn off insurance until after they've closed. Okay, make sure that all works. With that, I am done. Does anybody have any other questions? Hey, you've been a great group. Thank you for being here today.